Welcome back, listeners. I'm AR, and this is the third and final installment of our series on identity, power, and the shifting world of regions. Part 1 and 2 explored Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis, as well as Eurasia's connective corridors, Africa's demographic leverage, and the media dynamics that shape how we see it all. Today, we step into perhaps the most emotionally charged arena of the debate: migration, demographics, and the cultural anxieties now roiling Europe and, increasingly, Canada. We will ask hard questions about fertility gaps, fears of Sharia law, violence against minorities, and the raw power of population numbers, while grounding every claim in data and context. Let's start with number 1, Europe's migration wave. Facts before fears. The numbers first. Between 2015 and 2024, the European Union registered roughly 14 million first-time residence permits for non-EU citizens. Asylum peaks came in 2015 to 2016, and again in 2022 to 2024, driven by Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and more recently, Sudan. Eurostat data show that men aged 18 to 34 make up just over 60% of new arrivals in asylum channels. That gender skew reflects both practical factors. Young males are more likely to attempt dangerous routes across the Mediterranean or the Balkan corridor, and cultural ones. In many origin societies, men migrate first, then file for family reunification once economically or legally settled. Labor market poll matters too. Germany's 2024 shortage of 400,000 skilled workers and France's chronic vacancies in construction, care, and agriculture tilt recruitment toward able-bodied adults. Yet perception often outpaces reality. EU residents of Muslim background account for about 5% of the total population. This is Pew 2023. Even if all current asylum backlogs were approved, that share would rise only a couple of percentage points this decade. What alarms many Europeans is speed and visibility. Concentrated arrivals in specific districts, headlines about crimes, and political rhetoric framing migration as a civilizational wedge. On the question of whether there are new Pew results from 2024, Pew has not released a final Europe-specific demographic update in calendar 2024. But its research team has circulated provisional modeling that reruns the 2017 scenarios with 2022 to 2024 vital statistics and migration inputs from Eurostat. Those internal reruns broadly track the earlier medium migration pathway with a slightly higher base due to the 2022 to 2023 inflows and family reunifications that follow. In practical terms, that means the EU's Muslim share still rises gradually through the 2020s and 2030s, rather than leaping in a sudden step change. Looking toward 2026 and beyond, most demographers expect 3 forces to shape the curve: continued labor demand in aging economies, climate and conflict pressures on origin countries, and policy tightening that channels migration into more legal routes. Even under conservative assumptions, the share of Muslims in the EU edges higher by 2030 and again by 2040, with the convergence of fertility rates between migrant and native-born populations slowing, but not stopping, the rise. The key is that no mainstream projection shows anything remotely close to a majority in this century. Instead, the story is steady from a small base, with large national and city-level variations. A final note on visibility versus volume. Because arrivals are not evenly distributed, some municipalities experience rapid change while national averages move slowly. That mismatch fuels the politics. mayors in a handful of districts strain to finance housing, schools, and policing, while national ministries tout manageable aggregate numbers. The tensions between the lived intensity of the local change and the calmer national statistics is where much of the European debate now resides. For policy planners, 2026 will matter as a statistical waypoint. Eurostat's harmonized aging and dependency ratio tables will update long-term baselines, and Pew's next comprehensive release is expected to align to that timing. Expect minor upward revisions in near-term shares due to the 2022 to 2024 arrivals, but expect the long-run arc to remain recognizable from the 2017 report. Incremental, not exponential. Number 2. Sharia fears and the Islamization narrative. Polls by YouGov and France's IFOP reveal that 40 to 55% of respondents in Western Europe worry that Islamic norms will erode liberal values. The shorthand fear is Sharia law on European soil. In practice, European courts remained bound by secular constitutions. The handful of UK Sharia councils, for instance, issue non-binding family law advice, similar to Catholic or Jewish arbitration bodies. Still, enclaves where conservative Islamic customs dominate public space, like polygamy cases in Parisian banlieues, honor crime trials in Sweden, feed public concern that parallel legal orders are emerging. Much of the apprehension is semiotic rather than juridical. Headscarves in classrooms, halal certifications on supermarket shelves, or calls to prayer broadcast during festivals become symbols onto which broader anxieties are projected. When people say, Sharia is coming, they often mean, my neighborhood is changing faster than I can process. Media incentives compound this. Rare instances of extremism or criminality are amplified, while quotidian reality, small businesses, school runs, interfaith charity drives, barely registers in national discourse. Integration frameworks shape outcomes. Cities that pair firm secular norms with high-quality integration, like language classes, labor market access, civics education, and consistent enforcement, tend to see fewer flashpoints. Conversely, where exclusion hardens into ghettos, conservative social norms can become more rigid, not less. As community leaders step into service gaps, the state leaves. The policy lesson is not abstract tolerance, but visible pathways into mainstream institutions. There is also a generational hinge. Second-generation Muslims in Europe tend to exhibit lower religious intensity than their parents, as well as higher educational attainment and more hybrid identities, like being in football clubs, music scenes, and workplaces, which are powerful integrators. The trajectory is neither uniform nor preordained, but it suggests that fears of a wholesale Islamization of Europe misunderstand how secularization and acculturation typically work over time. Number 3. Crime, gender violence, and statistical nuance. High-profile cases, like the Cologne New Year's Eve assaults back in 2015, knife attacks in France and Germany, the 2023 Stockholm gang rape verdict. They keep the link between migration and sexual violence in the headlines. Criminologists caution, however, that immigrant status correlates strongly with age, income, and urban crowding, factors that also predict crime. Sweden's 2024 government report found that, after controlling for socioeconomic variables, first-generation immigrants were still overrepresented in violent crime statistics, but by a smaller margin than raw numbers suggest. The policy lever, researchers argue, is targeted integration. Language, job access, policing, rather than blanket bans. Several 2025 briefings sharpened the picture. Germany's Bundeskriminalamt notes that overall violent crimes rose modestly in 2023 to 2024, after the pandemic lull, with a disproportionate share of suspects being young men aged 15 to 29, native and foreign alike, concentrated in a handful of urban districts. When analysts adjust for age and neighborhood deprivation, the migration effect meaningfully shrinks, though it does not disappear entirely. This pattern echoes earlier findings in the UK and the Netherlands. Place and poverty explain a lot. Status at the border explains less than headlines suggest. Looking ahead, police services expect a continued clustering of incidents in transit hubs and outer ring suburbs where services are thin and rental overcrowding is common. The operational responses that show the best results combine community policing with rapid employment pipelines, especially apprenticeships for 16 to 24-year-olds. Cities that executed those pairings after 2016, like Munich and Rotterdam, report lower recidivism among recent arrivals than comparable cities that relied solely on enforcement. Gender-based violence requires specific attention. Women's shelters in Denmark and Austria reported spikes in 2023 to 2024 that reflect not only demographic change, but post-pandemic stressors and housing crises. Programs that pair culturally competent counseling with strict enforcement of national law are showing early promise, but they require trust building and stable funding. Expect 2026 to 2027 to bring more granular datasets that separate intimate partner violence from street assaults, allowing for better tailored interventions. Finally, narrative discipline matters. When policymakers communicate honestly about both the overrepresentation and the confounding variables, they retain public trust. Over-sanitizing the data breeds backlash. Sensationalizing it corrodes social cohesion. The path in between, acknowledge, disaggregate, address, may not thrill partisans, but it is how communities actually get safer. Number 4. Fertility gaps, Muslims, Europeans, and the demography of power. At the heart of demographic anxiety is a stark arithmetic. EU 27 total fertility rate, TFR, averaged 1.53 in 2024. Canada's dipped to 1.38. Pew estimates put the TFR of Europe's Muslim residents at roughly 2.1, below replacement in absolute terms, but half a child higher than non-Muslim averages, and far below levels in 1980s North Africa or 1990s Afghanistan. Here's why the gap persists. The first is religion and social norms. Islamic jurisprudence emphasizes family formation. Larger household size retains cultural prestige. The second is marriage age. Median first marriage age among Muslim background women in Europe is 3 to 4 years younger than for secular Europeans, extending reproductive windows. The third is economic trade-offs. Child rearing costs, female career aspirations, housing prices, and welfare design push many native Europeans to postpone or forego parenthood. Muslim immigrant households, often newer to urban professional norms, may accept lower per-child spending. And the fourth is policy incentives. Pro-natalist subsidies in France and Germany cushion costs, but have not fully offset secularization's impact on desired family size. So is low fertility a product of liberal ideology? Partly. liberal modernity elevates individual choice. Women's higher education and workforce participation correlate almost perfectly with smaller family size. But economics, like stagnant wages, precarious housing, and technological factors, like contraceptive access, are at least as powerful. Before we talk a little bit more about fertility, a quick clarification of the term EU27. EU27 refers to the European Union as it stands after the United Kingdom's departure. 27 member states operating within a common legal, economic, and statistical framework. When we cite EU27 TFR or migration counts, we are referencing harmonized data across those 27 countries, which is crucial for apples-to-apples comparisons and long-range projections used for pensions, healthcare planning, and labor markets. With that frame, two dynamics matter for the next decade. First, fertility convergence. Migrant TFRs typically decline toward host country norms within 1 to 2 generations, driven by schooling, labor force participation, and urban housing constraints. Second, age structure. Even if convergence proceeds, a younger age profile among migrant origin populations sustains higher birth numbers for a time, which can soften the blow of aging on welfare states. The scale of that buffer will depend on whether integration policies accelerate convergence or whether exclusion slows it. Finally, it's worth remembering that the desired family size is not fixed. Pro-natalist policies can move the needle modestly when paired with affordable housing, universal childcare, and flexible work. France's experience shows that stable family benefits and creches correlate with a TFR meaningfully above the EU average. No policy has found a durable way to lift fertility to replacement levels in highly urbanized, secular societies. But marginal gains matter for budgets and classrooms. Number 5. Canada, the next stress test. Ottawa plans to welcome 500,000 permanent residents annually through 2027, the highest intake per capita in the G20. 2/3 will arrive under points-based skilled worker streams, the rest via family reunification and asylum. Canada's Muslim population, now about 5%, could reach 8% by 2040. So far, social cohesion indicators, like trust in institutions, willingness to pay taxes, remain robust. But local flashpoints, like the 2023 anti-drag event protests, the 2024 Ontario school board clashes over religious accommodation, hint that identity politics is no longer a purely American or European export. But the pressure everyone feels is housing. Rent and prices surged in Toronto and Vancouver as population growth outpaced new builds. Policymakers face a paradox. New arrivals expand the construction workforce, but zoning bottlenecks and financing costs slow delivery. If Canada can unlock multifamily density around transit and scale vocational pipelines, immigration's economic benefits will be more visible to skeptical voters. If not, resentment will harden even as the macroeconomy grows. Demographically, Canada's strategy is actuarial as much as moral. An aging society needs contributors. Without steady inflows, the Canada's pension plan's contribution rates and provisional healthcare budgets would face steeper hikes. The political challenge is sequencing, front-loading integration supports so that newcomers' tax contributions materialize sooner, while reassuring incumbents that services will not be diluted. The final stress test is linguistic and civic integration. Quebec's insistence on francophone admissions and the federal government's multicultural compact must be balanced carefully. when the system misses francophone targets or fails to place families where schools and services can absorb them, trust erodes. Success, by contrast, tends to be quiet. High employment rates, thriving small businesses, and neighborhoods where religious accommodation feels routine rather than exceptional. Number 6. The flip side. Christians under pressure in the Muslim world. While Europe debates Sharia creep, Christians in parts of the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa endure lethal persecution. In Egypt, Islamic State affiliates bombed Coptic churches in Tanta and Alexandria back in 2017 with 50-plus deaths. Iraq's Christian population has shrunk from 1.5 million in 2003 to under 200,000 today, driven by sectarian killings and emigration. Syria's civil war displaced half its pre-war Christian community. In Nigeria, Boko Haram and ISWAP attacks killed an estimated 4,000 Christians in 2023 alone, according to Open Doors. These realities fuel Western narratives of a global civilizational struggle, but context matters. There's state weaknesses, resource competition, and jihadist ideology intersect more than pure religious hatred. The downstream effect is demographic hallowing of ancient communities. As younger cohorts emigrate to the EU, North Africa, and Australia, birth rates fall further in the homelands, shrinking congregations and closing schools and clinics that once anchored pluralism. Once numbers dip below a threshold, even benign policies won't reverse the outflow. People vote with their feet when safety and opportunity diverge sharply. International attention ebbs and flows with new cycles, but modest, sustained interventions have outsized effects. Securing church properties, protecting mixed neighborhoods from militia encroachment, and offering education scholarships that keeps families rooted. The alternative is a region more religiously homogeneous and less tolerant, which in turn feeds the very migration pressures Europe seeks to manage. For Western audiences, holding these truths together is hard. One can defend secular law and women's rights at home without caricaturing all Muslim societies, and one can advocate for persecuted Christians abroad without endorsing apocalyptic clash narratives. Nuance is not weakness, it's strategy. Number 7. Are we witnessing a religious resurgence? Globally, Christianity and Islam are both expanding in absolute terms, each adding roughly 30 million adherents per year, but along different geographic vectors. Islam's growth remains fertility-driven. Sub-Saharan Africa's TFR is still above 4.0. Christianity's center of gravity is also shifting south, but through conversion as well. Pentecostalism in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia accounts for much of the faith's dynamism. In the West, both religions face secular headwinds, yet diasporas re-energize public expressions of faith. Packed mosques in Berlin, booming evangelical megachurches in London's Nigerian community. What looks like resurgence in Europe is often visibility rather than proportion. New congregations, festivals, and dress codes stand out against a secular backdrop, making faith seem more assertive even if national religiosity metrics continue to drift downward. Paradoxically, the very freedom that allows non-belief to flourish also protects exuberant public religion. Over the next decade, expect religious energy to be more palpable in cities where migrant networks are dense and rent is relatively affordable. Those are also places where syncretism, like music collaborations, interfaith service projects, and mixed marriages, quietly reshapes practice. The headlines will fixate on culture war flashpoints. The lasting story may be a more plural religious marketplace that coexists with a secular civic order. For policymakers, the practical takeaway is straightforward. Safeguard freedom of conscience. Enforce one secular legal standard, and invest in civic spaces where different communities work side by side. Societies that do this tend to diffuse zero-sum narratives and keep religious diversity from hardening into political sectarianism. Number 8. Demography as strategy. Lessons from China's one-child era. China's 1980 to 2015 one-child policy averted perhaps 400 million births, delivering an economic dividend in the 2000s, but leaving a rapidly aging populace today. Median age 42, dependency ratios rising, and the first absolute population decline recorded in 2023. Beijing is scrambling with cash incentives and three-child slogans, evidence that fertility engineering can backfire. Europe's demographic dilemma is milder but rhymes. Once a society normalizes small households, reversing the trend is staggeringly hard. The cautionary lesson is that social norms, once shifted, are sticky. Generous subsidies have not restored Chinese fertility to even 1.5. Housing costs, work hours, and educational rat races matter more than propaganda. Europe's pronatalist experiments should heed to that reality. Stable, predictable support and affordable urban housing move behavior more than splashy campaigns. Another lesson is adaptability. Countries that adjust labor markets and retirement ages early, digitize public services, and automate routine work cushion the shock of aging better than those that delay. Europe's choice is not simply more babies or more migrants, but a portfolio: modest fertility gains, selective immigration, and productivity-raising reforms. Finally, China's experience reminds us that demography is destiny only for those who refuse to govern. Societies that plan around the population they actually have, older, more diverse, more urban, outperform those that mourn a bygone age. Number 9. Clash of civilizations. Still a useful lens? Migration flows, fertility gaps, and faith-based violence seem to animate Huntington's prediction of civilizational fault lines. Yet two caveats matter. First, demography does not equal destiny. Second-generation Muslim Europeans show falling fertility, rising university enrollment, and hybrid identities. Second, much of today's tension is intra-civilizational. Sunni-Shia rivalry, EU budget fights, US culture wars. Still, identity politics does shape strategic behavior. Hungary's Viktor Orban frames migration as an existential Christian battle. Jihadist propagandists speak of retaking Al-Andalus. The narrative itself becomes a geopolitical tool. If the thesis endures anywhere, it is in the realm of rhetoric and mobilization. Politicians and militants alike deploy civilizational language to polarize, recruit, and justify. But when we examine policy solutions that work, better schooling, fair policing, housing supply, targeted labor visas, they cut across the supposed fault lines and address shared human incentives. In that sense, the most useful function of Huntington's frame is heuristic, a prompt to look for places where identity and power intersect, not a script predicting inevitable conflict. The danger is allowing the metaphor to harden into dogma, blinding us to the empirical complexity unfolding in classrooms, clinics, and council chambers. The next 20 years will test whether liberal states can maintain a secular legal core while accommodating vibrant pluralism. The outcome will be decided less by abstractions and more by whether public institutions deliver competence and fairness across lines of faith and origin. Number 10. Policy horizons. Beyond fear or laissez-faire. What then can liberal democracies do? 3 tracks dominate expert debates. The first is smart borders. Tighten asylum vetting. Crack down on smuggling, but keep legal work and study visas flowing to meet labor gaps. The second is deep integration. Front load language and civics, and force secular legal primacy, insist on gender equality, and invest in high visibility policing in hotspots. And the third is pronatalism 2.0. Child allowances, affordable housing, flexible work, and immigration that prioritizes families, not just single males. France's birth rate bump during the 2000s suggests policy can nudge behavior, though culture sets the ceiling. To make any of that stick, sequencing is everything. If governments scale housing and schools before intakes surge, communities cope. If they lag, even pro-immigration voters sour. That means aligning migration targets with concrete delivery schedules for homes, classrooms, doctors, and transit. A technocratic challenge, not a philosophical one. Transparency also buys time. Publishing local absorption capacities, district by district, and adjusting quotas accordingly shows citizens that the state is matching ambition with realism. Coupled with honest crime reporting and visible enforcement of one legal standard, it drains oxygen from sensationalism without denying real problems. And because fertility headwinds are chronic, not acute, family policy must be boring by design. Predictable cash supports, childcare places within walking distance, and workplace rules that normalize caregiving for men and women. None of this electrifies a campaign rally. All of it moves the numbers that determine whether welfare states bend or break. Lastly is number 11. Is Islam compatible with the West? Here's the tough version of this claim, laid out plainly. Western democracies run on one set of secular rules that applies to everyone, with the state as the final referee. Classical Sharia, historically, is a full legal moral system that separates believers and non-believers, treats men and women differently, and puts divine command above man-made law. Most Muslims living in the West are good citizens and play by the rules, no question. The worry isn't about personal faith. It's about two legal logics trying to share the same space. When people talk about accommodation, critics hear a push for parallel rules around marriage, divorce, custody, inheritance, modesty, and blasphemy. The exact areas liberal law sees as individual rights. The fear isn't a sudden theocracy. It's a slow drift toward multiple rulebooks that undercuts the state's role as the one and only judge. Free speech is the next pressure point. In the West, protecting offensive speech is the whole point. Satire, mockery, even sharp criticism of religion. In a lot of Muslim-majority countries, formal or informal blasphemy red lines are real, and sometimes those expectations show up in Western streets. Think the Danish cartoons, Charlie Hebdo, and the Batley School incident, or the recurring outrage around Quran burnings in Scandinavia. The incompatibility argument says, if a religion treats insults to the sacred as punishable, it's going to clash with a system where the state must defend exactly that kind of speech. If the way we keep the peace is by quietly expanding hate speech rules, policing provocation, or creating media no-go zones, then we are hollowing out a core liberal safeguard. Then you got gender and sexuality. The critique here is that mainstream, not just extremist, readings of Sharia lock in gender hierarchy, like unequal inheritance, witness rules, guardianship norms, and reject LGBTQ identities as sinful. Most Muslims in Europe don't want coercion and adapt to secular law, but social pressure can still recreate restrictive vibes without any new legislation. Modesty policing in schools, pushback on mixed sports, family honor rules around dating and marriage, sermons that stigmatize queer people. Western law doesn't just tolerate differences here. It proactively protects women's autonomy and LGBTQ equality. When those principles collide with conservative doctrine, the state has to pick a side. If the law keeps choosing liberal rights, as it should, the argument goes. Conflict with hardline interpretations is baked in. Security is where critics say the rubber meets the road. The vast majority of Muslims oppose terrorism, full stop. But we've still seen jihadist attacks and persistent radical networks. Skeptics say the line between nonviolent Islamism and the violent fringe can be fuzzy. Both ultimately want society ordered around divine law, but they disagree on how fast and how forcefully. From that viewpoint, even soft Islamism is a constitutional problem, like pushing for special legal carve-outs, steering school content, and using hate speech norms to shield religious claims from tough scrutiny. Now, all that said, it's not a simple yes-no. Real life is messier and more hopeful. Millions of Muslims in the West already square their faith with secular law, accept one legal authority, and join in democratic give and take. There are also serious reform currents inside Islamic thought, like the minority fiqh, maqasid, or higher objectives, rights-forward readings, that make this reconciliation easier in practice. So the sharper version of the question isn't, are Muslims compatible? It's, can official religious bodies, mosques, councils, movements, commit clearly and without asterisks to 3 ground rules? Secular law is supreme, full gender and LGBTQ equality under civil law, and strong free speech protections, including for blasphemy. Where the answer is yes, the friction fades. Where it's hedged, the conflict keeps simmering. And the West also needs to be clear about its own non-negotiables. One secular law for all, equal citizenship, and big tent free expression. Everything else, prayer, diets, dress, worship, belongs to a generous zone of freedom. If organized Islam can live with those guardrails, compatibility isn't theoretical. It's happening. If it can't, the incompatibility argument won't go away, and liberal states have to be ready to defend their first principles. Closing the bridge to the next series. Demography is slow-moving, but relentless. Culture is sticky, but non-immutable. Combine the two, and you get the world's most underestimated power vector. Europe and Canada stand at an inflection point. Manage migration and fertility wisely, and they remain innovation hubs with pluralistic identities. Mishandle them, and the Huntington's clash narrative gains self-fulfilling momentum. In our next season, we will pivot from grand theory to ground-level case studies, how individual cities, companies, and communities navigate the cross pressures of identity and economics. Until then, remember, numbers tell a story, but choices write the ending. Thank you for listening. If this episode sparked new questions, email us at diplomacyanddiscourse@gmail.com. Subscribe and like for future deep dives. And as always, keep the dialogue civil and the analysis sharp.